interesting moment for the energy industry, and here, of course, in Houston, in the energy capital of the world. As anybody who follows these things closely, anybody who lives in Houston or is involved in the energy sector knows it's been a really dynamic time. But we're going to talk about a lot of these themes that we've touched on or that have been touched on over the course of yesterday and today, perhaps in a little more depth, really drilling into the energy transition. Barbara, I want to just start with a really broad question, and then, as I said, we'll get specific, but just to give a context of where you are, how you're thinking about these things. What does the energy transition mean for Houston? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? How do you think about those questions?
Sure. Hey, and this is a lot of fun, so glad to be here. Just want to make sure you can hear mine. Okay. So, you know, I think about the energy transition in a maybe a little bit different way. I think about it as it's an evolution of the energy system rather than there's energy and the energy system. So if you're in energy, you think about the energy transition. I think that's where we're at. That may have not been the case a decade ago, but I think it is. So what does this evolution of the energy system look like? Well, you know, clearly the decarbonization of the energy system is a key piece of it. But we've also seen you know, reliability, resilience, affordability, access. So the requirements of the energy system just keep getting, you know, bigger and bigger. And, you know, that's what we're all working on. So what does it mean for Houston? I mean, if you look at, you know, Houston is, and Texas broadly speaking, big energy producer, big energy consumer. And so we're in the act relative to the operations as it is, but it's also one of the dominant sectors in this city. So as the energy system evolves, so does Houston. So I call it ground zero because I'm a three-coaster. I was born in the Northeast. I lived in California, and now I live in Texas. You know, and if you're in some parts of the country, you're an energy consumer, and so you know it's different than if that is a leading sector for your city. So, you know, people have a real stake in the game on energy here, and that's both good and bad. So what I would say is, I think it's our opportunity to lose. You know, I think we have a responsibility, but it is an opportunity. And evolving incumbents, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about, whether it's a city, a sector, or companies, is really hard. But I think we have the will and we have the capabilities, and you know, hopefully we have the determination, the patience, and the support from both the city here, but more broadly, to be able to do what is necessary to do, because it's going to take a long time. Anyway.
Great. Yeah, lots of good threads in there that we'll pull on in the course of this conversation. Yeah. I mean, you said if you're in energy, you think about the transition, and I want to ask, you know, in this moment, how thinking about the transition has changed. Obviously, we're in a really different place today than where we were a year ago before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was very different from, say, April 2020, when crude prices in the U.S. briefly went negative. A lot is in flux, and so I guess the question is, how has thought about the transition changed in this new environment where oil prices are high, where there's a lot of money to be made? Are we thinking about the transition differently?
I think the momentum continues to accelerate. I think that so if we look at if we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it reminded us of how essential energy is, and we continue to be reminded about that through this winter. We were reminded about energy security. Those are all aspects of this energy system that are required. But we also look at Europe and realize that the energy transition looks different depending on where you're at. We are absolutely fortunate in this country, despite all the challenges we've talked about over the last day. We are basic in so much resource. And so we have options, and we have pathways towards a more evolved energy system. Europe has a lot weaker hand relative to energy, and unfortunately, they were dependent on someone or a country that didn't turn out to be a good thing. So I think that it will do nothing but accelerate, but it'll also color the picture or help us see the complexity of the energy system challenges in the energy transition by these kind of realities that we see in the system.
Right, so the new environment hasn't so much slowed it as much as it's changed it, perhaps made people think more about these things that have always been there, security, reliability, that weren't discussed enough as part of the transition.
Well, I do think, there's this terminology, I don't know exactly who coined it, of resource nationalism, but I think it brings home the fact that you can control what's inside your borders, and so having your energy resources, whether they are fossil or renewable, solar, wind, so forth, if you have them in your country or neighboring countries, you have a lot more security. And so I think I think we will probably have a better dialogue here in the U.S. understanding what we have, the breadth of what we have. And I think Europe will realize that they need to develop more local, which in the case of many of the countries is a more renewable system.
Right. Well, as I said in sort of introduction, you spent more than 30 years at Chevron, have some insight into the majors, even though you're not currently working there. But I guess I'd just be curious to get your sense of how you feel the incumbent players are doing, managing the transition. Are they doing enough in your view?
So I'm going to answer that first. No. Okay, I just have to ask, where were you on June 15th, 1987?
1987, that would have been just a little bit before I was born.
Okay, that's what I figured. Okay, so in the old days, I started working for Chevron. Just wanted to ground us there.
Yeah.
Reggie this morning said he was in Berkeley in 1989 when there was an earthquake. I remember that. I was working for Chevron. So just to ground, I spent 25 years working in the base business of Chevron. I had come in as a research chemist. I got an MBA in finance. So I worked on a bunch of downstream businesses. And so I knew about products and customers and inventory and all those things that you think about in business. And, I got up every morning and hoped that, one, we hadn't hurt anybody, that we hadn't spilled anything, that there wasn't a natural, weather event somewhere that was going to mess up my logistics. Those are the things you think about when you're running a business that is day in, day out, and it's all about reliability. And so then in 2013, I moved to Houston. So I've been here for about 9.5 years to run the ventures company and the head of innovation. So I went from running parts of the base business to, if you're the head of innovation, you are the chief disruptor of the company. And what you think about is the change agenda. So I started thinking a lot about the energy transition and where was the energy system going to be disrupted, and then how do we bring innovation into the company. And this issue of how incumbents evolve and how incumbents innovate there's been lots of scholarly work on this. There's lots of consultants working on this. It's a hard thing when you're an incumbent to change. I had the great fortune that I worked for a company that had said, we have to do two things. We have to have a part of the company that doesn't spend all day thinking about today's business, but thinks about tomorrow. So that was good, a very purposeful intention to set up some part that is out there looking. and that also looks more outside than inside, because we can look in the mirror and think we're doing pretty good, and all of us know what that looks like. So when I started, you know, and working in a wide variety of decarbonization, putting solar panels in the oil field, to electrify or to use renewables to produce steam. You know, these were demonstrations. They were economically non-viable, but we wanted to see if they would technically work and operationally work, and then as the cost came down, could we incorporate them? So, you know, I give those as examples of having an organization supported by the top deck that would be looking outside. It's not easy. The incumbents, you know, again, 95% of the employees are focused on today's business, and they need to be. But the top deck needs to be focused on today and tomorrow, and then putting some part of the organization whose purpose is to look outside and to get the company ready to make changes to the base operation and to grow new businesses is required. The incumbents need to be part of the energy transition. There are parts of our society that don't want them to be. I find that unfortunate, and I hope that through our dialogue we can figure out that, one, we're not going to decarbonize the energy system unless they're part of it. Just do the math. Two, that there's a lot of skills and capabilities and assets and in the incumbents to do that. But what I don't think the incumbents will do is they won't lead it. They will be leaders, and many of them will be leaders in this new energy system, but they won't necessarily be the first one to start up the hill. We saw that in the automotive with Tesla was the one who really pushed on the electric vehicles. General Motors had some of the stuff, but he got Detroit to move. And so I do think that the disruptors, and that's one of the key benefits of having disruptive new companies that aren't focused on today's business, but they're only focused on tomorrow, they are a key catalyst to help the incumbents move. And then when the incumbents move, they can move in a very purposeful way, in a big way, and they can be part of that future system.
It's a interesting perspective. They won't lead it, but they'll be pulled. I'm curious, what's the Tesla for the energy sector? I mean, maybe it's Tesla, but what's the Tesla for the energy sector, for oil and gas specifically? You know, and then perhaps more broadly, what are the other catalysts that might really start this transition for the incumbents?
So solar and wind is, in some respects, part of the disruption. It has certainly competed with gas in terms of power generation. To be honest, gas and the whole shale revolution was a disruptor for coal. But I think a lot of the startups that are working on ways to produce hydrogen in a lower cost way, in a lower carbon way, is the disruptor. So it's a bunch of smaller companies. They've grown, but it is not one like Tesla, because energy is not one product that we're selling. Some of the other catalysts, we all know it. They are investors that say yes to some things and no to others, right? So whether it's ESG funds or specifically these things we will not have. They are governments with carrots and sticks. They are university endowments. All kinds of things can be catalysts. I think just a couple others. I think the employee base is a catalyst, and wanting to their company to be part of the future, to be part of this new energy system and really pulling their own company. So there's a wide variety of incentives, but I do think you need that impetus because most of the company is focused on the current business.
Right, right. Well, I'm curious, thinking just a bit about time frame. I think most people, in the industry, even some who might not like to admit it, would say that the energy transition has begun. We are, this is something that is happening. It's a question about how fast it happens. And I guess, thinking about Houston specifically, thinking about some of the incumbent energy players here, but also thinking about the city and the people who live in it. What are the risks of the transition in Houston and with these sort of local players? What are the risks of that transition not happening fast enough, of getting left behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's a real risk, I think that Houston has benefited, and Bobby mentioned this last night. It benefited from a vibrant, strong U.S. economy, our U.S. energy industry that has contributed, and there's jobs, there's a tax base, all those things, and so keeping strong companies and keeping Houston attractive for the energy business, however you define that energy business, I think is critical. So I think looking forward and being progressive about that is absolutely critical. I think people found out during the pandemic, people live wherever they want to live, right? So are we able to attract people, and are we able to retain them? So I think all of those elements are parts of a dynamic city, which has some really strong sectorial anchors here.
So what are some of the attractive elements? I mean, just to talk a little more specifically, that some of the assets that make Houston a place where you think make the energy sector of the future want to set up shop here. Could be hard assets, could be sort of soft things, education, universities.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things for something like energy. The assets, the infrastructure. So we're not going to throw away the current energy system, right? It's just huge, right? So we're going to evolve it. We're going, hopefully, repurpose a lot of things. I'll give you a couple of examples of repurposing. You've heard of renewable fuels, and this work didn't start because of climate change. It started 15 years ago when George W. Bush, and this wasn't a Texas thing, this was a national thing, was, we need some energy security relative to high crude oil prices. So we said, can you make renewable fuels or biofuels to be able to extend the energy supply that was grown locally? Since that time, renewable fuels has taken off, and it's a major component of transportation fuels. A lot of that is made by processing renewable feedstocks in refineries. So that's a case of repurposing a refinery to make the products that are wanted today versus the products that were wanted yesterday. Pipelines, the same sort of thing. We have hydrogen pipelines here for gray hydrogen. They can be used for whatever color hydrogen you make, because the color is the process, not the product. Obviously the product's the same. And so I think assets are important. I think capabilities. We've talked about that here. The capabilities of people to do capital projects in energy, in industrials, in this city are huge. And we have lawyers, finance, everybody, they understand the energy industry. In fact, I think there's just such a high level of awareness on a sector, on the energy sector here. So I think that it's a local language, people understand it, and so that's got to be a strength.
Right. I want to ask just a bit about the cost of all this, obviously this is an immensely expensive proposition. You need to get capital flowing. How do you do that? What are the mechanisms? What's the pitch that you make to the capital markets? To I guess I should ask, what is the best place to look for capital, and then what is the pitch you make to those places?
So this energy transition is, it's different than other energy transitions, and it's even different than the one we talked about with coal to gas, because this one has some non-market-based drivers, and certainly, decarbonization ultimately has an economic price tag, but it doesn't have a price tag today, and we don't have those mechanisms. So the capital markets work pretty well when you can show economics, and it's just much harder when you can't, which is why the ESG funds we're trying to have other mechanisms. And so there's some things where we're asking these changes to be made, and they're for societal benefits. And so the good thing is that governments have stepped in to do this, again, both with carrots and sticks. That a number of investors have said, these are the areas I'm going to focus on. And so, I think there's plenty of capital to be able to do the things at the various stages we need to do them at. And the one other thing I would say is that the more we can get things to the point where the normal market mechanisms of economics work. In other words, if we can get the cost of hydrogen or the cost of solar down so it can compete, in a market-based competition, it just makes the economics and makes the investments so much easier.
Right. Well, I have maybe 1.5 questions, then I want to get a couple questions from the audience, so think about those. But just to follow up on this point, I mean, ESG has become a hot button issue, particularly in the state of Texas, perhaps not as much in the city of Houston. But how concerned are you that the sort of climate in Texas, and sort of the ideological opposition to the transition, even as it is clearly happening, might stop Houston from being the energy capital of the future, or it might at least deter people from wanting to set up shop here?
So I have a lot of concerns about that. And I think that, some of it is that this subject has gotten incredibly polarizing. And it's gotten political on things that it shouldn't have gotten political on. On both sides, I think, right? But I do think, I think that there are things that you can talk about in this area that you can find common ground. I do think, if I was talking to somebody and said, well, here's how I would think about it, and if I was going out to Midland, which is also in Texas, but it's not in Houston, where are the business opportunities for this? And and I do say this when I go to the Northeast, which is where I'm from, is that this is ground zero here. People, earn a living and support a family in the energy industry, so you don't tell people to just stop doing it. No one would do that. So where are the business opportunities, and how do we ensure that people don't take one for the team from in terms of their family? So I think for workers is how do we see a future for them in this future energy system? Okay, I'm just going to say this, the Neanderthal that thinks that we don't need to address climate change by having methane regulation or actually even, measuring and mitigating methane. I don't know how to talk to that person. There's science, the technology is here, there is capability to do it. The only thing I'd probably say to that person is, if you've got kids, go ask them what they think about this stuff. If you've got grandkids, go ask them. Because it is also about, the future. And so I worry a lot because it's become ideological rather than thinking about, this is also Texas's to lose. Texas is the biggest energy state, and we have all kinds of ways to continue to be that large energy producer in the future. And if you're going to stick your head in the sand, I'd rather you not do that in a position of influence. Okay,
right.
That's enough.
Right. No, I mean, that makes sense. Talk about the opportunity. Obviously, it's very difficult to go to someone and say, time to take away your job, but to say, actually, there's this immense opportunity and we can all benefit from it. I have one more question just to ask a bit about. I mean, you talked about repurposing of infrastructure, which obviously makes sense given that infrastructure is expensive to build. Of course, we've heard today quite a bit about some of the justice considerations, frontline communities that are affected by this infrastructure. So how do you deal with that? How do you thread that needle in trying to repurpose infrastructure, but also dealing with some of the inequities that are faced by people who live in the backyard of this infrastructure?
Yeah, so it's a big question.
It's a big question,
right?
I know.
And I think some of these things were built when considerations were not there. I think it's one of the reasons that siting and permitting is also a very difficult thing. But we have to find a way to, one, address the environmental consequences of the existing infrastructure and existing operations. There has to be a level of performance and condition on that. And then, we're going to have to find a way for pipelines and pipes and facilities, but with new environmental, specifications that work today. That I don't think there's one silver bullet, but I think there are lots of examples where where it has been done better than others, and we need to strive to continue to improve.
Thank you so much to Barbara for this discussion.
Yeah. You're welcome.